Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show, The Nation Talks. And for the next 60 minutes, I'll be your host, and we'll be talking about a whole range of issues that I suspect will excite and entertain you. In fact, I'm pretty guaranteed it will do. But let me start, as I always begin, by saying this has been another great day for British democracy. In the Commons today, and if you haven't seen it, I would commend it to you. We had the Prime Minister, who was questioned by Plaid Cymru, who asked him if there were any beliefs in Downing Street anymore. And this is how our super sophisticated ex-head of the crime arrangements in Westminster Department of Prosecution said, look here, he said, I have one belief, and it's you're talking absolute rubbish. But that's what he said. You're talking absolute rubbish. Luckily for him, he was supported by Nigel Farage, who said, I'm so glad that you're moving towards us. Now, I think a lot of people in the Labour Party might find that awfully troubling, but not the Prime Minister. He took it with aplomb. The other news, of course, tonight is that the boss of Thames Water, no less, one of the water companies that has befouled the River Thames and many other water courses in England and Wales, was asked how he justified getting a bonus, listen to this, getting a bonus of £200,000 almost for, listen to this, 3 months' work. 3 months' work, right? We can't afford winter fuel payments, but we can afford to organise for this guy to get over almost 200k for 3 months' work. I won't tell you what his total salary is because I don't want to upset you on a fine Wednesday night, but you can look it up if you want to. Anyway, enough of all that. Let's get down to the meat of the programme. I have a particular pleasure in welcoming our guest tonight because he is the creme de la creme. If you want to look at the intellectual force in Scotland, look no further than our guest tonight, Pat Kane. Welcome, Pat. How are you?
I'm very well, John, and very delighted and honoured to be on your fine show with your vast studio behind you, pulsing away with information and energy. So it's very nice to be here.
Do you see all the people beavering away behind the scenes to make this possible?
It's an incredible corporate exercise. I'm very, very, very impressed.
Isn't it fantastic? And think of it, folks. You can support all of this if you go to the Indie Live website, and you'll see, for example, that there's a crowdfunder because all of this marvelous technology has to be paid for. And the guy that's making all of this happen is the guy behind the scenes who featured in one of our shows recently, and that's Kevin Gibney. And I would strongly encourage you all, and in fact, I would suggest to you that with all my vigor and vim to go and support the crowdfunder, because unlike the BBC, we do not have a budget of almost £300 million per annum. It's a good deal less than that, I can tell you. But you won't see 1 hour of Pat Kane on the BBC. I can guarantee you that. And that's what we have for you tonight. So why don't we kick off, Pat, by talking about Starmer and the Island of Strangers. Were you surprised by that statement?
I wasn't surprised by it. I mean, I've got a number of perspectives on it, John, some of which are kind of in the trenches of party political argument, i.e. I don't have no great time for the Labour Party, and I support parties of independence. So, I mean, the more they flail and flannel and fail, the happier I am. But I think there's a big question facing all parties. I don't know if you've heard of a book by a woman called Gaia Vince called Nomad Century. It's an extraordinary book about climate and migration. And she basically says that as a consequence of Western industrialism, the Western capitalist model, not just in the last 70 years of neoliberalism, but for centuries before that, we have populations on the move being burnt out of their environments by climate change and by global warming. That has been caused by capitalist imperialism, extracting from the earth, despoiling lands, despoiling territories. And these people are coming, and they're coming north, and they're coming north to every polity that was involved in empire. And I think we have to kind of begin to get to grips with our responsibility for a world on the move. And it's one of these, it's a story that no one can tell. Maybe the reparations story begins to tell it, but no one can really integrate it into the heart of their policy discussion and their political discussion with their Western democratic citizenry, with the electorate. The topic can't be broached, and because it can't be broached, no one confidently does it in a kind of with a kind of visionary leadership. It allows people who are suffering under various austere regimes, various challenges to their lifestyle. It allows them to be susceptible to finding a scapegoat that they can punch down at. And there's a mature perspective on what migration means and what the genuine root cause of it is that we're not even beginning to have conversations about. So this is not to get Starmer off the hook. I mean, Starmer is basically eschewing that leadership. Is anxious about a right-wing populist who wants to hit all the fear and anger emotive buttons that they can, easily finds a way to do it, and he's trimming and responding in the way that the right of the Labour Party often do when facing deep crises that are a particular force within British politics, the Labour right. And I mean, as someone who quite supported Corbyn and saw the way that they behaved with him, I'm not surprised that they're being so opportunistic with adopting right-wing racist language when it comes to this. But I think there's a broader concept, there's a broader context to how national politicians in the West deal with inevitable baked-in migration. It's not really about labor. It's not really about labor markets and nurses. And I think it's the deepest issue, and no one is addressing it at the depth at which it's required to be addressed.
And I mean, there's nothing terribly new. I mean, I remember signals about migration 10 years ago, and people saying exactly that, that these people finding themselves in an environment which is untenable, they have to go somewhere, however difficult it is to make the transition, because where they are at the present is unacceptable, and they can't live there. And back then, people were saying, so the West needs to be prepared for these people coming our way. And they have a legitimate case to make. They can say, for example, well, you helped to cause these conditions, which I find untenable, and therefore I have every right to come to you. And now what we find is that no action was taken back then. Farage was just a mirage at that time. But now he's here and he's real. He's picking up votes in Scotland, where they have nobody on the doorsteps, perhaps. It's very worrying.
But we have a bit of. I mean, I remember Salmond, maybe 10, 12 years ago, positively going out and saying we are a multicultural country. There are many strands to our tartan, I think was the famous phrase that he used. And I think there has been a lot of effort. There's been a lot of cultural effort, literature, drama, exhibitions, trying to kind of create a sensibility that is beginning to be mature enough in the way that I'm talking about. I mean, someone said in one of my favourite blogs, Bella Caledonia, the other day, not Downing Street but Kenmure Street, and what they were referring to with Kenmure Street was obviously the kind of mass upsurge of protection, defence of these asylum individuals that they surrounded the police car with and stopped their deportation. So I think there's a global leadership role. I mean, I was actually quite a fan of Humza Yousaf, as much for the spectacle of him as for his effective leadership, which maybe wasn't that effective, maybe too early. The job was too early for him. But I'm proud that he was there as a kind of a symbol, the first Muslim leader in Europe, the European Parliament, and I'm very, very happy with the leadership position he's put himself in with relationship to Gaza, but also in relationship to world issues as well. So I think Scotland has a leadership role to play in these mature arguments. And I think the more that our leaders do that, set the narrative, set the tone, people will follow. And I think, reform is on the rise in terms of poll numbers, but I mean, I don't think they're on the rise to the extent that they're going to be jointly in government at the next election, which is what everybody imagines. The SNP, as a nationalist party, is portraying a vision of the nation which is much less reactive and much more tolerant and much more capacious.
Yeah,
I think we should value that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was made very clear by John Swinney.
Yes.
But I have to say that aside from that, I detect a certain timidity in the SNP and the government. It seems to me that there's a lot of people sitting there saying, I think Leslie Riddoch put it rather well. She talked about people being very comfortable inside the cage that was set by Westminster. And they're doing great work within the cage. They're busy cleaning and they're sweeping up and they're throwing all their detritus out. But they're still inside the cage. And nobody's even wrapping the bars. And I think that troubles a lot of people. How do you feel about it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot of trappedness in the independence movement at the moment, particularly within the parameters that they've set themselves, which is, how do we proceed to get a constitutional referendum? How do we use various plebiscites to demonstrate willingness? At what point do we wait for a 60+% run at 6 months or 8 months, which can show the world that its independence is a settled will of the Scottish people? So there's a lot at that level, which is just a motor or an engine for frustration. And I think a lot of activity has to come out with a trapped devolutionary government, trapped within the Westminster system, trapped by the Supreme Court decision. And I think there has to be energy that comes from elsewhere in Scottish society. I mean, you mentioned my great friend Leslie Riddoch. I mean, Leslie's constant refrain is that there needs to be, I mean, she wouldn't use the A word, she wouldn't use the anarchist word, but she would probably accept it in a philosophical argument, which is to say there needs to be a lot more bottom-up confidence and vigour and agency in Scottish life. Her particular thing, and I'm completely with her on this, and I want to actually support her on it, is she talks about for example, the prospect of community renewable energy projects, and the fact that communities, if they step up to the plate to get their wind farms commissioned for the next 20 years at this particular crucial moment when the recommissioning happens, could have a flow of money into their coffers, which a bit like Shetland and the oil levy could provide genuine power within their communities to improve the fabric of their communities. Like £100,000 per megawatt generated for that community, as opposed to a few thousand if they let corporate and commercial endeavours develop it. Now, that kind of actual community power is genuinely empowering in other ways. People feel, I think that there's a prevailing narrative going on that we are powerless in the face of grand forces. Now, independence, national self-determination is a counter to that. But I don't underestimate people's cynicism about politicians and the political class in general. I hardly think after the last couple of years with the SNP that skepticism has been reduced by the behaviour of representatives. So I think we need new practices of power in different parts of Scottish society, and I think certainly community energy is one. Land and resilience on food is probably another, and maybe housing is also a third. And there's a beautiful part of Leslie's book, in Thrive, where she lists 360 community trusts, land trusts, all from all parts of the country. And she says, look at all that competence. Shouldn't it be being more militant about what it can build and what it can secure for communities? So small I independence for me lies in these practices, and it's the best basis for large I independence, because it will make people feel as if they are empowered citizens rather than just 4-yearly, 5-yearly voting fodder, or people who are there to be triggered by political ideologists. I think we need more power, active and distributed throughout Scottish society, and that will partly mean people acting in their locality, asking for forgiveness, not permission, as opposed to too much yearning for another constitutional opening like the one that opened in 2014. That the pressures that are going to open that up again, I think, are going to come from a different place than us being, electoral wizards, as we think, as a lot of the independence discussion is about.
I would agree with that. And the other thing too that I detect is that there's lots of stuff going on at grassroots. I mean, we've had people in the programme, very impressive. I mean, people in islands and in very remote areas beavering away, doing stuff that, but the stuff that nobody hears about. But they all have a common concern. It's this disconnect with the government in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
In other words, they call people, they invite them, nobody comes, nobody returns the phone call, and all of a sudden they see some government minister making statements that are completely contrary to local interests, because they haven't sampled local interests, perhaps, to the degree that's necessary. And time again, we get evidence of this disconnect, because it seems to me that it's a two-way street. I mean, it's good and proper that people work away at the local and the grassroots level, but it seems to me terribly important that somebody at the centre actually connects up with these folks and first of all says, this is laudable. In other words, I approve of this, even if they can only do it on a personal level and they can't do it for some peculiar reason on a political level, at least do it personally. But there's just nothing of that. I mean, the commonest phrase we hear is that John Swinney tends to look at politics through the wrong end of a municipal drain pipe. It's all about, keeping the drains open and stuff. And that again is laudable. I'm not trying to sort of diminish that and discount it, but nonetheless, that's not what people are looking for. They're looking for that form of leadership that says, I applaud what you're doing. I would love to see more of it, and I'm going to come and meet with you. It's not a big deal.
But you see, but John has all long had a perspective on the process as Team Scotland. That as if everybody has to sort of line up behind one particular idea, and the more unity that we have, the more effective the country will be. I think when you look, we talk to land reformers, for example, someone like Andy Whiteman, who should be an asset to the country, but finds himself constantly railing at the timidity in terms of dealing with the land imbalance and empowering communities to do more. But and I think they're missing a trick. I think the Scottish government are missing a massive trick in no one having the light bulb go on in their head that the more that they empower communities, the more that they change legislation, the more that they tilt the ownership of the country back towards communities and away from corporate ownership, particularly around land, particularly around energy. The more legitimacy they will have amongst their citizens when it comes to the national vote. And I think it's not really John's idea of people pulling together at the top. It would not be as powerful as to say, make it possible for 52 new community energy renewable projects to be facilitated and enabled by legislation and policy, rather than it being, a black box of decision making into which poor decisions come out that do not rectify the power imbalance in the society. I think if representative politicians want to be re-legitimated with their voters, that's what they should be doing. Much more than just being in a jousting match with their opponents across the aisle. Basically, as Ian McWhirter once said, you couldn't put a policy fact paper between the Scottish Labour Party and the SNP, but I think that so there's a narcissism of minor differences there. But I think if politicians are looking for legitimation from their citizens, I think they should try to think about ways of giving away power to those citizens, material, real, economic, social, territorial,
I think that's
technological power. They should do that. To me, some politician will suddenly realise that's actually a good move. Not yet though.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the experience we've done, this is our 202nd show, and we've had we've had masses of people on the show saying this is what I find would be most welcome, is the government being sympathetic to local concerns. For example, we interviewed somebody from the islands, the Western Isles, who was concerned about second homes.
Yeah.
And the fact that it drove young people out off the island. And these homes were only occupied 2 or 3 weeks a year. And they said there was so much that could be done. But that person has to travel a couple hundred miles to the council offices, never mind Edinburgh. And you think, hold on a second, guys, couldn't you look at that antiquated, antique structure of the counties in Scotland and replace it with a whole bunch of smaller entities? It's in your power to do it. Why don't you do it? I mean, for example, I spent a lot of time in Perth and Kinross. Kinross was a poor relation to Perthshire. Such reason. At one time, it had its own council, it had its own town hall, and its own library, gifted by Carnegie. That was all swept away when it became part of Perth and Kinross. And the ironic thing is that Kinross was offered to Clackmannan. And because they were told, you're too small. This was a Tory government in power at the time. You're too small. Now we have Clackmannan, which is scarcely bigger than Kinross as a separate entity. And Kinross was offered to Fife, who turned it down. And you think, this is pathetic. This is just, now you've got a chance, you've been in SNP's in power for all these years. Why don't you take a cleaver to all that crap that was there that the Tories thought was a good idea, and it clearly isn't, and it's not working. And you could bring power, you could take, for example, you could separate Kinross from Perth and return it to its former glory and have people voting consistently for the 12 or 14 councillors they had instead of the 3 they have now. It would be so simple. It wouldn't be a particular earthquake. You'd be actually rendering power to people locally.
You'd also be doing something that, as many people have said, as a precedent in Scandinavian and European countries. I mean, the precedent that's often cited is Denmark, which has hundreds and hundreds and thousands of local prefectures that have much more sovereignty over their conditions than in Scotland. But there's a kind of we did have a kind of faith in citizens as a consequence of the Constitutional Convention and the constitutional process in Scotland. But it's late on the scene compared to Scandinavian countries. I mean, they've had a century of thinking about how to empower their citizens at a national level. And they had a strong, their national revolutions, as it were, or national self-determinations, had a strong yeoman farmer kind of character to it. The person who's expresses their citizenship by being in control of their immediate resources and their immediate productive resources. So we've got a whole history of parlous centralizations and redivisions and rezonings and all the rest of it. I think one thing that we could genuinely do is to stand back and try and devise a system whereby people have power at the locality level that they recognize and feel is most natural. Exactly. And try that out. And I think that's a challenge because we don't have those European and Scandinavian traditions. But otherwise, people are going to do it themselves. The Cowell community, who famously went to bid for their wind farm and didn't get it, and we'll find out soon who actually did get it, were a convention of 6 land trusts who came together to say, we are going to, in this area, go for our own energy. So that kind of autonomous federation or conglomeration of entities, short of a full constitutional rethinking of local government, is what's going to happen. People might decide to declare that they're bioregion. They have defined themselves as a bioregion, a water table, a landmass, and then start to kind of govern themselves on the basis of that. I mean, I just think I'm quite into that kind of fertile, fruitful chaos model. I think at least it bespeaks activity and intent and energy.
But it seems to me we have the very opposite.
Yes.
Of that, what we've got is a centralized, ossified system of government that people increasingly have less and less faith in. And the remedies are straightforward. I mean, has anyone from the government asked you to discuss this? I mean, because we've had so many people say the same thing.
Well, I mean, I take my cue from my colleagues in the think tank Commonweal, who pointed this fact out to me a couple of years ago about the ridiculously poor ratio of government to citizen in Scotland compared to places like Denmark and Holland and Finland and other places. I think that raises another interesting question, John, about the think tank scene or the policy scene in Scotland. I'm very, very proud of Commonweal. I'm very proud of what they've done over the years, but they have been very much a bit of an outlier or a bit of a lone voice in terms of sustainedly doing policy work to justify major reform in a Scottish independence context. And the reason why they've done that is to be able to say, here's what independence would bring, here are the reforms, the better practices that it would bring, here's the international comparison on that. So I think the reason why the answer to your question is why have I been brought in to discuss this, or has any of my colleagues in Commonweal been brought in to discuss this, is I think due to the fact that they are sort of banging their own drum on their own for such a long period of time. There's a bit of I'm sitting in Edinburgh at the moment, and a city like Edinburgh should be able to support 2, 3, or 4 indie think tanks to come up with plausible policies, and it's just not. It's a poor show in Scotland at the moment, actually, when it comes to independence policy making. It seems to constantly rest on the shoulders of Commonweal, and I think we need more activity in that respect. Scotonomics, who's often on your show, William Thompson, being a notable exception to that, and an excellent exception to that.
But again, there's not much interaction between these nice folks and the government. And you say to yourself, if you looked at that in a Westminster context, that you would be in the corridors of power consistently, because they would piggyback on that input, they would utilize it. Scotland has the opposite condition, which seems to be that we've got a civil service and they will take care of this sort of business.
Yeah, and they are our intelligentsia.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a civil service, and that's not adequate. That's not fair on the civil service.
Exactly, and also it's weak government. It suggests that I'm terrified of talking to people who really know what they're talking about. I'd rather use an interface. I'll give you an example. What happened to us? We put together a constitutional commission, and we came up with a constitution for Scotland. And we tested it and did all the rest of the good things. And we went to the government and we sat down with them. And it was the most extraordinary thing because we ended up talking to a bunch of lawyers whose connection with constitutions was minimal. I've always found that to be an odd thing. You would think that lawyers would take to constitutions like a duck to water. But
yes, you'd have thought. So when the lawyers revolt, then we all should be worried about things changing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, maybe we need that. But they said, "Oh, this is great. This is super," And then we got a call saying, "Could you come in and talk to us?" And we thought, "Great, we'll be talking to a minister about moving this forward." What happened was we were in a room with these 2 lawyers, and they said, "Look, there's a page or 2 in the paper that talks about the monarch would be an elected position, i.e. there would be a vote on whether or not to continue with the monarchy." And I said, "Well, yeah, that was a bit of a throwaway remark because nobody was particularly interested at the time." Yeah, so we spent an hour talking about what was a frivolous section of this whole paper. You're talking 400 pages, and this was sort of half a page. And that's because somebody somewhere had a burr under their saddle about this. But nobody was interested in the real essence of it. And it was, how could you use this to support a drive for independence by reassuring people who didn't support independence that their rights would be safeguarded thereafter? Nobody understood that argument. And we thought it was such an obvious argument. It's just, how do you appeal to all the folks who feel frightened? because all of a sudden they end up in a new state in which they did not vote for. How do you reassure these people? This is the perfect way to do it. You say this: whatever government is elected is bound by the Constitution, which enshrines these rights. Bingo.
Sure.
Nobody understood it. I mean, they still don't understand it. We, for example, had Stephen Flynn on the show, and we talked about the Constitutional Convention that the SNP is committed to putting together. And I said, could you put us in touch with somebody who in the SNP who's doing this so we can talk to them? We're still waiting 9 months. So opportunities to work with people outside the party lines are shunned. And it's a great pity, seems to me.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we had. I'll tell you about the thing Spring that we're organizing, that we're involved in, that we've launched about a year ago, and just kind of trying to kind of make it work as a kind of holding space for certain kind of discussions in Scottish life. But we had conversations with Stephen Noon very early on, before Stephen Noon became an advisor to John Swinney, and Stephen was trying to kind of, with his PhD, who was a very, very famous advisor, as you know, from the SNP in its heyday, contributed to many election victories. But with his PhD, when he came back to Scotland, he was trying to kind of revive what he thought was the spirit of the Constitutional Convention, which was a kind of generosity of spirit.
Yeah.
That the idea that a Labour Party would countenance a PR system that would possibly deprive it of total executive power in a proportional election system was to Stephen an indication. He even called it a politics of love, and by what he meant by that was that you could have a kind of your opponent could be an agonist rather than an antagonist. I.e., you're not out to destroy them; you're out to have a decent, proper, dignified debate with them. Apparently, the assisted dying bill was a bit of an exemplar of that in the Parliament just a couple of hours ago. So there's Stephen now working as an advisor for John Swinney, and I'm watching with great interest to see whether any of that politics of love, politics of post-partisan, inclusive relationship is persisting into his gig. But I think that's the spirit of a constitutional convention, or that's the spirit. You've got to sort of think that what is the underlying system that's going to run the country, and that cannot be a necessarily an ideological matter. But Scottish civil servants are not public intellectuals, and they're not independent think tanks, and they shouldn't be. I mean, it's an interesting, to me, that's an interesting story that you tell, that they weren't even capable of going onto the centre ground of what the effectivity of your constitution was going to be. That shouldn't be the role. If you have a Jerry Hassan on your show, I know. I mean, Jerry is a one-man living policy think tank entity, all of his self, but he's the first person to tell you that he bemoans the lack of an institutional. Now, we could also look to Scottish academics who maybe aren't playing their part as independent supporters, which I know many of them are, and even bringing some of their nighttime hours, if they can't bring their daytime hours, some of their weekend and evening hours, to the question of formulation of Scottish policy for independence that makes it plausible in the meantime, and isn't just waiting for the great thunderclap moment to come in and then rushing in with their policies. To create a functioning world of independence is what policy development should be doing, and there's not enough of it in Scotland.
Yeah, and they don't push the envelope. There seems to be a high comfort level with the status quo, which is, I find, very sad, because Scotland has so many needs. The status quo is not going to serve the needs that are out there. Quick question from Julie Brown. She's asking, do you think if we get a majority for India in 2026, could we go straight to negotiations for independence?
Well, I say not yet, not even then. I think we need a devolution level of percentage support for independence consistently. Now, if that's what's expressed at a national election, then that should be the trigger for a period of time where I would give it 6 to 8 months, 6 to 9 months, where cephalogically, in terms of polls, we are at 60 or 60+% consistently, so that looks like there's a settled will. And then I think it becomes problematic in terms of the democratic credibility for the Westminster government not to begin to think about another referendum on independence. I suppose I'm a wee bit more patient than I was in recent years about the independence process, because I feel as if one of the classic things that is a trial and a tribulation for independence is the way that it's so easily rendered as the most difficult, hardest, toughest, most technological, most risky thing in the world to do. And I think that we need a greater sense of confidence about how to handle those changes in Scottish society than exists at the moment.
Yeah.
For me, there's a 5 to 10 year argument for independence, which is to do with what are the frameworks within which you can cope with automation, climate change, migration, aging, demographics. There's a series of massive challenges and problems in people's lives coming up that it should be the case that a national sovereign polity should help you deal with and help people get through the transitions from one state of affairs to another, from one paradigm to another. That should be the role of Scottish independence. And I think this is me with my futurist hat on. I think so. There are some extraordinary changes to come quite soon in the technological and even the biological front. I mean, I think we're looking at very, very much looking at longevity, stretching out even further than it is at the moment. I think we could possibly be looking at an absolute holocaust against jobs, not just manual jobs, but mental jobs. There's a wave of developments coming there. And as I say, I think climate change is going to put migration pressures on Western societies. Independence has to be a solution to these kinds of problems. And problems like, well, what do we do when machines take over 80% of our working lives, or potentially or theoretically? What is the purpose of our life if that's the case? So that presents fundamental challenges and questions to a national government, which is like, well, it's self-development, it's care, it's improving, beautifying our living conditions. It's paying more attention to other people because we've been liberated to do so by
I think that makes sense. But as you say, there may be massive changes that make that might shorten that timescale. Not because anyone in Scotland contrived to do it, simply because, for example, there's a reform government in Westminster that enacts Trumpian logic, and it immediately wipes out substantial portions of the population. And somebody in Scotland stands up and says, this has got to stop. And that means that it's a very sudden transition.
And I don't think people cope well with sudden transitions. I mean, this is why I'm mentioning Swinney and Stephen Noon. Those are bright people, clever people. They want to be innovating ahead of a crisis rather than just in response to a crisis.
Yeah, and anybody who was in that position would be gaming the thing. They would be saying, hold on a second, what do we do if Farage is Prime Minister at the next election? Because it would be disastrous for Scotland. And the idea then that one could take one's time to negotiate with somebody like that and convince them that this is a good idea sounds fanciful. And therefore you've placed in a position whereby the negotiation has to come from a position of strength rather than weakness. And that means accumulating the strength now in terms of arguments and in terms of research in order to deal with that. But that might not be possible. I mean, I'm looking at Trump just now, and he's doing things that, frankly, most Americans would have found impossible.
Sure.
6 months ago, they were saying, well, there's no way that we're going to sort of
Sure.
remove great thousands and thousands of people from welfare because they need it. And we spent decades putting legislation together. Turning to Trump for a second, what do you, as you look ahead, say a couple of 3 years, how do you see America developing at the end of that 2-year period, let's say?
Well, I think that there's a contradiction at the heart of the Trumpian regime, which is that they have on one side a whole bunch of Christian nationalists who want to drive personal and family life back to the 50s, 40s, maybe even earlier on one side, and on the other side, they have the tech bros who have some of the most extraordinary fantasies about their future existence, but who basically move fast and break things. So to me, it's always been an incoherent coalition waiting to fall apart because Christian nationalists concerned with stable lives cannot necessarily exist with transhuman, posthuman characters like Musk and Thiel and etc., who want to kind of turn public administration into a kind of lean startup and at the same time stick wires in people's heads, surround themselves with robots, disrupt their employment conditions. So to me, the Trump regime is always set for disaster. And I think the classic way for a regime like that to shore itself up is to find either an internal or an external enemy or both. But the interesting thing is that as many people are beginning to say, Trump's crudity is revealing the outlines of the structures in which we've been living in, which is a kind of Pax Americana. Now, if for whatever reason, whether it's a kind of misguided patriotism, he's revealing that to be the case, then we have to think geopolitically about how we operate in that environment. I came to this realization a few weeks ago and wrote about it in my column this week. The relationship with Europe as a bloc becomes absolutely essential. So independence in the European context, to me, becomes completely obvious in the face of Trumpian multipolarity, Trumpian forcing of the world into particularly economic blocks. I think I am not an absolute idealistic fan of Europe. I can see how corporatist it is. I can see how centralizing it is. However, I think geopolitically, Scotland has to be aligned with Europe. I'm sympathetic to people talking about EFTA. Maybe it doesn't have to be membership, but in terms of the way that Trump is consolidating power and shifting power relations in the world, I think that's got to be the Scottish focus. But
what do you see?
I look at Trump and I see I use a word called the Caligularity. He's the Caligularity. He's like he's this monstrous presence. He's like a character from all the satirical American novels, from Philip Roth to Thomas Pynchon to Don DeLillo that I ever read in my life. He's come to life and amalgamated in one character, no doubt guided by extremely clever people at an extremely deep level. But it's a moment of tragedy for me, John, when I think of Trumpianism, because as in my singing voice and in my work, I am an American fan. I can't even help it. It's just the way I sing and it's the way I perform. So I have a vested interest in a good America coming through at the end of all this. But my faith is being sorely tested at the moment.
I think, as we discussed offline, I think he is where he is because of the manipulation that took place perhaps on social media to allow
Yes.
And he will do it again and again as often as he can get away with it. But we don't have time to go into all of that tonight. Maybe in another show we could go that in a bit more detail. But the situation is he is where he is. He's taken that whole corporate ethos to a new level. He's in Qatar, a state that he denigrated in 2007, I think, as being a home of terrorists. They are still hosting Hamas. And yet he's now taken an Air Force One jet from them And when he was asked, do you feel this is a compromise or something, kind of me, aren't you compromised because you've taken this largesse? And he said, well, the present one was a bit shabby and we should all have been ashamed of it on the tarmac. So it was my job to go and find a better one. And somebody said, well, what you're doing is against the Constitution. You're not allowed to do this. You need the agreement, the approval of the Senate. And he said, well, that's a technicality. I've had it checked with the person he appointed as the Attorney General, and she says, okay. I mean, you get this sort of incestuous, I appointed people who will obey my will, and these people have told me that this is okay. So therefore, constitutionally, I'm free and easy. The fact that the actual written words run counter to that. I mean, I've watched some of his appointees on television recently, and they were actually told, here's the Constitution, and this is what you're doing. How do you square these things? And they say, well, it's an executive order. The president's in charge. I mean,
he came down the stairs on his trip to the Middle East with, I think it was Mohammed bin Salman, who the leading prince, the Saudi prince, a wanderer, the person who ordered his goons to tear the journalist Adnan Khashoggi to pieces a couple of years ago. I mean, it was like something. It's like something that you would imagine AI would generate, but it wouldn't really. You can't imagine it would be really happening. But the man is a monster, and Trump is legitimating him as if. I mean, but there's weird stuff going on, John. His speech, Trump's speech in this context, is very Putin-esque, because it's talking about every culture having the right to kind of have its own coherence and generate by its own lights and live we must live in coexistence with cultures that are not our own. There's a guy called Alexander Dugin who's a major feed-in to Trump and to Putin and the Putin-esque worldview, and that's exactly his position. His position is that we should be get ready to live in a world where we have strong, as it were, ethno-states. That are powerful in their own right and they're contending against each other. I mean, that I heard that as clear as a bell, and I don't know if necessarily Trump is a Russian plant, but certainly Trump has consonance with oligarchic thinking, and I think we must in Scotland maintain our democratic principles and our democratic alliances with entities like the European Union that simply don't think like that. Well, it's not very well governed, but it's not a sympathetic global set of oligarchs, which is how Trump is operating.
Yeah, very quickly, what's your take on BRICS, i.e. Brazil, Russia, India, China, etc., and the role that they will play in the future, particularly since, as you say, Trump is in the process of effectively getting rid of Pax America. We now have it seems to be all the chips have been thrown up in the air, and we don't know how they're going to fall down. As a futurist, what would you suggest the way they might fall down in terms of the power shifting across the world?
Well, I think again the Trumpian chaos. However disreputable and dislikable we see the man, is revealing some structures that we have been reliant upon for many years. So, for example, the dollar is the kind of the reserve currency of the world. How could that be the case that everybody else is trading in dollars and not trading in renminbis or not trading in some other currency? I mean, why wouldn't there be an African currency, for example, that would have some strength about it, as opposed to having everything being subjected to the American capacity as a fiat economic power to generate as much cash as it wants and to be the backstop. So I'm a constant reader of Chinese progress, as it were. And I think, and not just Chinese progress, but see even vast countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. And I think there's not just a realignment of economic power. There's a realignment of civilizational power.
Yeah.
Back in the direction of the East and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And I think it's profound. I think it's rooted in more than just economics and ideology. It's rooted in religious traditions, Confucianism,
Yeah.
Buddhism.
Yeah.
As a different attitude towards self, towards society, towards organization. And we could also say the same actually for the Islamic world. There's going to be things that we can learn from societies that seek balance, as opposed to us and our competitive individualism. There's going to be some things that we can't learn and we don't want to learn, but there's going to be some things that we will learn. And
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. It's interesting to watch countries like China do capitalism better than the capitalists at the moment, because they have a kind of sense of, patriotic direction at a very large level, and a desire to see the country generally improve and go forward.
Yeah.
Indonesia is also fascinating in that respect as well. Taiwan, South Korea. So I am going to be growing old in a world which is post-American.
Yeah.
Exactly. Hopefully not anti-American, but certainly post-American. And I think it's going to be interesting. I think the technologies and the business models and the organizations, it's already interesting.
Exactly.
Something like TikTok is almost like firewater for European users, the electric cars and everything else.
Exactly. It's hard to argue with that. And the fact of the matter is that there was a standoff between Trump and China, and he stepped down. He went. And he came up with the usual palliative, which is for 90 days, we'll have a wee think about it. You thought, well, hold on a second, guy. You were the guy that told us 2 weeks ago that think all the thinking was done. And these people were in the wrong. You told us why they were in the wrong and why you were imposing these huge tariffs. Now, today, you're telling us, well, actually, it's not as bad as some people said. Well, the only people who said it was you. You were the guy that said it. Now what he's doing is saying 90 days. Everyone I know is saying the 90 days will become forever, because they have capitulated. So he's capitulated to China. He's got a situation where we almost risked a nuclear holocaust between Pakistan and India, and he tells us that he went and fixed that. Well, the facts are opposite. The facts are that the Indians say we had no contact with Trump, and that the Pakistanis. What happened was they decided that there was a smarter way to do it, which was to control the water resources into Pakistan. But that's the way superpowers work. We have to get. I agree with you. We have to get used to the fact that our focus was west. Our new focus will need necessarily be eastwards, perhaps, if we exclude Brazil, and that will result in profound changes. I'm not sure we're quite equipped to deal with all of that good stuff that's come there, and all the bad stuff as well.
Well, Scotland, I mean, to come back to an old saw in Scottish independence politics, I've been noticing people saying, well, the changing world situation means that we need to kind of revise our politics on the retention of nuclear weapons in an independent Scotland, or the desire to get rid of them. I couldn't disagree more. I think we're in this, as the India-Pakistan situation showed, but also as the kind of calls for us to match battlefield nuclear tactical weapons in recent days, that we should to tool up for that. That's a new era of proliferation. There's nothing that could be an act of global dignity and leadership than for an independent Scotland to continue to support the idea that we get rid of nuclear weapons from the set. It would be an act, it would be a de-escalation act that many countries around the world will regard as heroic and proper and anti-proliferation, because I think the possibilities for proliferation are enormous at the moment. And I think we should be brave and bold about that. And I don't think it's time to kind of resile in that position at all. And I think that's the way that Scotland should come into the world, as someone who deals with the ultimate question of the 20th and the 21st century, which is that we have the capacity to destroy ourselves. If any of this starts. So a peaceful Scotland it's going to be a big part of our soft power to follow through on that if we ever get anywhere near independence.
Exactly. Well, time is marching on. We have one question that we got from from David, and he didn't get an answer to it, but I'll see if I can find it now. Yeah, it was. Yeah. No, I can't find it, David. He says, he's asking, is your patience, inverted commas, on Indy due to the lack of a program or vision for the future fledgling nation?
No, as I say, because as a member of Commonweal, I've been involved and I've been supporting people who have been thinking consistently about how to make it happen, the institutions required, the design of those institutions. I would like two or four more backups on that. I'd like there to be more parallel endeavours. So I don't think there's a shortage of big plans. I think there's a conjuncture that will emerge. I think it's a combination of what a Farage's regime would do. I think it's a combination of a Scottish government that has a certain confidence about what it's going to do. But I think that there's a popular element to this, and there's a community element to this. People have to be resilient in the face of saying Scottish independence is the riskiest thing you can do in a risky world. They have to be strong in the face of that. Now, building up that strength, I don't know if you remember the To See Ourselves documentary. I think the To See Ourselves documentary, apart from the heroic figure at the heart of it, was a great demonstration of how people can be so knocked off beam as economic citizens, as political citizens, by relentless propaganda against the idea that independence is a credible exercise. We have to find ways of strengthening that mentality. There's many initiatives that are trying to do so, but it has to manifest itself cephalogically in terms of the polls. Yeah. And the polls are a spectacle. And I think if we have 6 months of 60 plus, I think things really, I almost, maybe I'm being slightly mystical about that, but I think it starts to look like there's a genuine crisis of democracy on these islands. And I think when that crack begins to open, I think various things will rush through. But it's everyday confidence about independence is the thing that most exercises me at the moment. And I don't know what the timescale in building that up is, whether it's 6 months, 12 months, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, I'm not sure. But I think that is one of the key components that we have to try and generate.
Super. Thanks, Pat. I can't let you go without talking about Hue and Cry.
Well, you could.
What are your plans?
We are bringing out an electro-digital dance record at some point over the next 6 to 8 months. It's being mixed at the moment. And I can't tell you the title, but it's very, very optimistic and very, very futuristic. And you may see me with some strange headwear on at some point in the future.
Well, there you are, folks. You heard it here first.
Run a mile.
We've only got a couple of minutes. Any last comments you would like to make, Pat, before we close?
I think the only last comment I would like to make is that I am so proud of yourself and your colleagues at Independence Live, Broadcasting Scotland, all the other entities, who, by virtue of their commitment and their selflessness and their efforts and to some degree the crowdfunding that you were talking about at the beginning, have managed to create a keep going, a Scottish public sphere. And I think, there's probably not hundreds of thousands or millions watching this particular broadcast, but they are people who will act and are thoughtful and have made a commitment to the future of Scotland, which is in a direction and in a way that I will always be allied with. So I just want to congratulate all of you for keeping going, for mastering the technology, for showing that it can be done, and for being a bit of an exemplar. I always hoped that there would be Scottish independence media, and between the National and yourselves and all the others, it exists. And if it exists, it can make a great effect. So well done to everyone.
Thank you for that. And we welcome the support we get from all the people who join us every Wednesday and for all the other Independence Live programs. So with that, that's a reasonable way to round up this evening's broadcast. Thanks very much to you, Pat. We've really enjoyed it. And perhaps, since we only covered about 2 or 3 of the questions that people wanted to ask you, maybe you'd be kind enough to come back again and we can talk some more.
I'd be delighted to. Be delighted to.
Great, thank you. And thank you to everyone watching tonight. Stay safe, take care, look after each other. Good night.
Bye all.